Good evening. Glad you're here. Welcome to St. Paul's. 60 years. And yet, we are here. And so is God. 60 years, and yet we remember the tension of those times and the tension of these times. 60 years, and yet racism continues, and voices continue to call it out. 60 years, and yet a family, the Harris family, witnesses to grace in life and love and home and justice in Cedar Rapids. And their family legacy continues to influence and surround us tonight. 60 years, and yet we have a vision, we have hope. I've written a brief summary for all of you in your worship materials tonight. For those of you who haven't maybe heard the story before and you just heard a glimpse, an invitation to come for some reason, here you are. I hope you'll find it to be a blessing in the many perspectives of this historic night as we remember. It was a night to remember where meeting 60 years ago, the meeting adjourned after 11 p.m., and that will not be the story tonight. I wonder if there are any of you here who were here in attendance 60 years ago. Would you please stand? 1, 2. 1, 2. Thank you. We're glad you're here. Tonight, in just a minute, we're going to start hearing some different perspectives of this night 60 years ago. We're going to begin by hearing a little bit about the Cedar Rapids culture and context from 1961 from Mark Stouffer-Hunter, Cedar Rapids historian. We will also hear, after Mark, we'll hear perspective on the vote and its connection to Lovely Lane United Methodist Church from Reverend Scott Meador. And then we will have perspectives from St. Paul's members that have been collected by Reverend Jerry Oakland. Jerry, a retired clergy, and he's also our executive director of the St. Paul's Foundation. We're going to follow that with perspectives from Reverend Dr. Jackson Burns, who was the pastor 60 years ago, as he reflected in some lectures that he prepared a few years after this historic vote, with the highlights, some of those highlights shared by Reverend Jonathan Hefner from St. Paul's and Ann Harris Carter. And finally, a family's perspective from Ann. So let's get started. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sherry. Good evening, everyone. It's an incredibly important historic moment tonight, as we'll hear about throughout the evening. And trying to capture a little bit more of the local historic perspective of this event and what happened before, what was happening in 1961 at the time of this event, and the result of that. As early as 1872, after the Civil War, Cedar Rapids was going through a lot of social changes. And we had a very established collection of immigrant groups in Cedar Rapids, mostly from Scotland, Ireland, England, Germany. And two major things happened in the community in the early 1870s. One was a huge influx, which most of us are more aware of the story of the huge influx of the Bohemian immigrants. We now know it's the Czech people. All of a sudden we became a Bohemian immigrant community in accommodating that big social cultural change. The other was the early black community. And Dr. John Ely, who had been a surgeon in the Civil War, saw the great need of the establishment of a black community in Cedar Rapids. And he donated land free of charge to house the first home of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which still stands at 512 6th Street Southeast on the north end of what became known as the Oak Hill neighborhood. And Dr. Ely, who was one of the many founders of Cedar Rapids and was connected to all of the other early community leaders who helped start so many of our religious religious organizations, churches here, did this in the spirit of opportunity for all who can contribute to the sense of community for Cedar Rapids, and no one should be left out. And that early sense kind of got a little bit forgotten over the decades, and you'll hear a lot tonight about how world events affected Cedar Rapids ultimately. And as we got into the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were hard changes that happened in the community, and there was kind of the perception that certain people should live only in certain sections of Cedar Rapids. And because of these early establishment of black churches in the Oak Hill neighborhood, Bethel Church and later Mount Zion Baptist Church, there was an early perception that that should be the only section of Cedar Rapids that certain folks should live in. And when policies changed going into the mid-20th century that affected Cedar Rapids, we generally have this perception of a community that really does work together very well. But there were things under the surface that happened. I grew up really trying to understand from the time I was, because of my age, I grew up being the first generation to watch Sesame Street. And so my ideas of everyone getting along was watching Gordon and Susan get along with Bob and Mr. Hooper, and Ernie and Bert getting along with Roosevelt Franklin. And I was a big Star Trek fan. And to me, Lieutenant Uhura and Mr. Sulu were just as important in the community of their spaceship as Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy. And then when I began studying early Cedar Rapids history, a pang of misunderstanding, I started using one of the great references that you can use to learn about Cedar Rapids history is to use these wonderful reference books called Cedar Rapids City Directories. And I thought, what a great way to learn about where things were and where people were and what they did. And I would just see the listings of people's names and their occupations and what street they lived on in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And then sometime in the early to mid 20th century, I noticed the city directories all had the word COL after some people in our community, which meant colored. It happened here as well. And I thought, why? And it would really changed. That's when I realized that, history is complicated, and social history is very complicated. And a lot of issues became really difficult for members of our community, especially after World War II. And I know I grew up in Cedar Rapids thinking like, well, other cities have certain problems. Other cities have certain issues with, racial tensions and other groups and so forth. But right before the December 13th, 1961 meeting here, 60 years ago, things were going on in Cedar Rapids like Nat King Cole. Did you know he performed in Cedar Rapids in the 1950s? But only about 2 places in Cedar Rapids would allow him to sing. And he had to be played at the Foxhead Tavern down on 1st Street, across from where City Hall is today, because most music establishments would not allow him to play in other venues because of his color. Nat King Cole. And I have talked as a historian to some of the folks that went to that show. One of the best shows they ever saw in Cedar Rapids history. Best time of their life. In many years I talked to Cecil Reed, and all the things he told me about running the Sepia Motel out of Mount Vernon Road, because most hotels and motels in Cedar Rapids would not allow black patrons at their place of business in Cedar Rapids. Many of the hotels and motels. Going into 1961, the anniversary that we're commemorating today, which we'll hear so much about tonight, Cedar Rapids was going through a lot of physical and social change. And these kinds of incidents were happening. Over here on the east side of Cedar Rapids in particular, historically the largest numbers of black population tended to be on the east side, particularly the Oak Hill neighborhood. We did have a very equal system of education. We have people of color in our high school yearbooks going back to the 1880s and 1890s at the old Washington High School. But generally blacks are only seen at public schools in and near the Oak Hill neighborhood, at the Tyler Elementary School, the old Adams School, the old Monroe School, and the old Washington High School and McKinley School. So events leading up to December 13th, 1961, it's kind of interesting to kind of take a look at what was happening specifically leading right up to 1961. Washington High School was newly opened at Forest Drive and Cottage Grove. And yet we had systems in place that black students could go to the new Washington High School, but there was discouragement from them living right by the high school. Physically, the city was about to go through a major period of urban renewal. In fact, in the 6 months right before December 13th, 1961, 5 months earlier, the city had torn down its train station down at Green Square in the summer of 61. Merchants National Bank had torn down a lot of buildings on 2nd Avenue for expansion of their bank property down there. Lindell Plaza had just opened up. Lindell was brand new, folks. And that ties into Robert Armstrong and his role in this great story. Robert Armstrong was incredibly prominent in the community's news in the years, especially leading up to 1961. He didn't like the idea of something called a suburban shopping center. Long time affiliated with this church, of course. Robert and Esther, who I both got the pleasure of meeting at different times. And so he did this amazing thing 2 years before the meeting 60 years ago. He built a brand new downtown department store. Armstrong's new downtown department store. In 1959 it opened up in September, a whole year before Lindell Plaza opened up. And he had made so much news about this that he changed the course of downtown Cedar Rapids for the next 20 years. That meant we had a downtown retail that was active and vibrant as a retail center because of Robert Armstrong's decision for the community. And what that meant was that at the time of this meeting and the question of the house lot on Beaver Avenue for the Harris family was that people listened to Robert Armstrong. He really meant a lot to this community. He did, and he always has, and he always will. And at the time, the Harrises were living at A Avenue and 11th Street, right across from St. Luke's Hospital, in a house that was owned by St. Luke's at the time. Just so that's where they were. And the home becoming, and there were a lot of new elementary schools in the suburban neighborhoods that were being built very quickly, like Erskine and Monroe on the southeast quadrant. And Robert Armstrong realizing that everybody wants to contribute to the community, and everyone who does contribute should get equal access to what the community has to offer and what they have to offer. So that's kind of the fabric of what's going on in Cedar Rapids in 1961. And we had a flood earlier that year, so that happens all the time, it seems like. Not as big as 2008. So you hear more details about what Mr. Armstrong did. I just want you to point out how high profile he was. And this led to the right thing to do, the successful outcome of that vote, which was very contentious and very emotional and very important. Robert Armstrong followed through on his support of the Harris family continuously. After the home on Beaver Avenue was established, of course, many of you remember Percy Harris having his office for many years in one of a couple of Armstrong's buildings downtown, the SGA building or the Professional Park building. Why history is so important, why we're here tonight, and why it's always going to be important is that it gets to the core of what is important to all of us. The critical core of why history is so important is that something that doesn't change in 2021 from 1961 on December 13th is the constant need for the kind consideration to everyone who contributes to our Cedar Rapids community. That should never change. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was terrific, very informative. I know I appreciate hearing you speak and learn a lot, and I hope we can learn a lot tonight and become better people and find ways that we can continue to work together for a very good purpose. My name is Scott Meador. I'm a lead pastor at Lovely Lane United Methodist Church here in Cedar Rapids. I've been in this role since 2018, and I really do love the church that I serve. I also love our history. Our church, Lovely Lane, began back in 1959 when the Board of Missions of the North Iowa Annual Conference of the Methodist Church gave authority to negotiate for the purchase of real estate, a church site in the growing area of northeast Cedar Rapids. Plans were also made at that time to seed new churches in the other three quadrants of Cedar Rapids. An agreement to sale was signed in January 1960, about 2 years before the historic vote we are remembering tonight. All this for land located on what would become the corner of 42nd Street and Winnig Road. Lovely Lane's first pastor, Dr. H. Hughes Dill, was appointed in 1962. Dr. Dill was a retired clergy person and chairman of the Board of Missions, but he died suddenly just before the first service as a newly organized congregation. Until our first building was built, worship took place in the Chapel of Memories at Cedar Memorial. The church moved into the building on Winnig Road in 1965. I am very proud of our beginnings as a congregation. I'm also proud of who we are today at Lovely Lane. Our church tries hard to be a welcoming congregation for all people. Several years ago, the congregation developed a welcoming statement that is used in our bulletin and our website. And basically, the statement says that we believe that all human beings are persons of sacred worth, are recipients of God's love and grace, and deserve our love. Furthermore, we welcome, accept, and affirm all persons without regard to gender, ethnic background, sexual orientation, national origin, age, or anything else that may exclude them from our love and God's grace. We are proud of the church that we try to be. Might even add that we're actively working to be anti-racist. We're looking at participation in anti-racism summer camp as we have conversations with their youth and engage in book studies. As I share all of this, and I do have a purpose in sharing all of this, I realize that there's another narrative out there about our church beginnings, in which some persons from St. Paul's who are not happy with the vote that we observed tonight left St. Paul's and started Lovely Lane. This is not a narrative that we embrace, but we want to acknowledge that it has hurt people of sacred worth. As often happens, circumstances are complex. Some persons certainly might have left St. Paul's and gone to other churches, including Lovely Lane, but it is not our understanding these folks began our congregation. We definitely realize pain that might be present, and we absolutely want to be a part of the healing process. A person who lived in Cedar Rapids in the 1980s recently told me that he heard through trusted sources that Dr. Harris's heart would break every time he heard Lovely Lane's name mentioned. This breaks our hearts and Lovely Lane too. The more I hear about the exemplary character and compassion of Dr. Harris, and I was hearing stories even through the latter part of this afternoon, the more I wish I knew him. What a remarkable person he was. It breaks my heart and others' hearts too that he might have felt the way that he did. It's not unusual to have different narratives as we understand history. The truth is we have 4 different narratives about the life of Jesus. We have Matthew's, Mark's, Luke's, and John's. We understand we may see things differently in terms of Lovely Lane and the vote that night 60 years ago. And we understand their deep wounds and pain that continue as the years move on. But we want to move forward with the Harris family and others in Christian love. In 1 John 4:16 we read, God is love, and those who remain in love remain in God, and God remains in them. A favorite hymn of mine is, They'll know we are Christians by our love. The words in this hymn include, we are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. We pray that all unity may one day be restored, and they'll know that we are Christians by our love. We look forward to moving forward in Christian love to be the people that God calls us to be. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight, and may God richly bless each of you.
I'd ask you to imagine that you were there 60 years ago. Jim and Joe were there, but imagine you were there too. 60 years ago on this night, you were upstairs in the sanctuary, sitting in your favorite spot. You probably remember being squeezed in between your parents and friends with people you had known your whole life, as well as people you'd never seen before. From your perspective, there was standing room only. Maybe 1,000 people were there. You were young. You'd never seen such a large crowd at this church, a crowd that was so on edge. Faces were grim. The mood was hushed. Some persons refused to make eye contact with others. Down front and center was the district superintendent, Dr. Charles Hempstead. You looked at your watch and saw that it was a little after 7:30 when he opened the meeting. He was the man to be in charge. He had to control how this meeting went with hundreds of anxious people. Did people squirm a bit when he read from the scriptures, reading from Moffat's translation, beginning with verse 7 of 1 John 4, Beloved, let us love one another, for love belongs to God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Then Dr. Hempstead offered brief devotions and prayer. You may remember then how he explained how this meeting would proceed. All speakers would be limited to 10 minutes. He reminded you that there should be no interrupting of speakers. But that didn't stop people from applauding when they heard something that matched their perspective on one side or another. And he said, Dr. Hempstead said, a Christian corporate body has some things which appertain to it, which do not to others. We should welcome the opportunity to demonstrate faith in Christ, to take a definitive stand on what it means to be a Christian, and to be able to express certain convictions which we believe are in accordance with the will of God. Well, you remember that night that before you could get to this discussion about selling property, there was first a resolution by Mr. Philip DeVoe from the building committee asking for authorization for the trustees to demolish the parsonage next door on 3rd Avenue to make room for the construction of the new education building. Well, apparently there wasn't much discussion about that. It passed quickly because everybody was ready to move on to the main topic for the night. You could feel the tension. You could feel the anxiety. You must have held your breath as Mr. Edward Sears presented the resolution for the church to sell property to Dr. and Mrs. Harris. What would happen next? Well, Mr. Robert Armstrong was the first to speak, and he used his full 10 minutes and then sat down. He was the one who started this, after all. He had given the property next to his home to the church, and he was the one who had invited Dr. Harris to make an offer to purchase the property. Questions were answered, questions were asked, answers were given. Pillars of the church spoke, some in favor of the resolution, some not. You heard some people object to the church being put in this spot, and you heard others claim that the church needed to be a witness, not only in this community, but also in the world at this time. You examined your own beliefs, the things you'd learned at home, the things you'd heard in confirmation class, the words of people you respected. There were clearly two opposing points of view. Each voter would have to make a decision about how to vote. And then after one opposing speech, Dr. Jackson Burns, your senior pastor, asked to speak. He gave an impassioned speech. This is the time for the church to act, he said. The time has come for judgment to begin in the house of God. We must decide whether we are a Christian church or have abandoned Christian principles. I am willing to stake my future on this issue because I believe in it. You were proud for the witness of Dr. Burns, knowing that he was the right person for this congregation at this moment. And then it came time for the vote. Ballots were handed out and people began to fill them in and hand them in, but then somebody objected. Somebody questioned the integrity of that process. So Dr. Hempstead started over. Somebody had to go and find the membership roster. And every name was read one at a time. A lengthy process. I imagine there were 3,000 members of the church. A lengthy process. If a person was present, he or she stood and handed their secret ballot to a teller. Counters began counting as ballots were collected. And while you waited for the ballots to be counted at the end, after all the names had been read, Mr. Lewis Blair made a speech about how the work of integration would be an ongoing obligation of the people gathered, no matter the outcome of the vote. And then came the announcement. 751 votes were cast. 460 were yes. 291 were no. After this announcement, there were some concluding remarks, and just after 11 o'clock, the long, tense meeting was adjourned. But the discussions continued in your home, in your Sunday school class, and in the community. In fact, newspapers all over the state spoke about that night, that vote, that moment in history. And you were there. The impact of that decision has influenced you ever since. A step was taken, a big step, but certainly not the last step. For even yet, the journey is not over. We all are being asked, what will be our next step?
As has been stated already, one of the key figures involved in the vote on December 13th, 1961 was the Reverend Dr. Jackson Burns, lead pastor here at St. Paul's. Dr. Burns' tenure here began in 1954 and continued until 1966. The year of the vote, 1961, Burns was 47 years old. And I believe that we may have his only living child, Alan, joining us from Maine on our live stream. So welcome to you, Alan. As his obituary notes, Dr. Burns often lectured at theological seminaries, but his most significant lectures came in 1964 when he presented the Lyman Beecher Lectures at Yale Divinity School. The Beecher Lectures have a long and a rich history dating back to 1871, and are hailed as one of the most distinguished lecture series on preaching in the world. Under the title Preaching to the Divided House, Dr. Burns gave the Beecher Lectures, reflecting on the preacher's task as a prophetic role, the vital role of conflict in the life of the church, and more particularly, he spoke about the vote that was conducted in this building 60 years ago tonight.
Dr. Burns presented Preaching to a Divided House as a 4-part series, and I want to share some excerpts from each of those lectures or sermons. The first was entitled The Word That Divides, and in this introduction to the series, Dr. Burns speaks of his love for preaching and emphasizes somehow the modern minister must find a way to preach the prophetic message, to preach it so lovingly that his people will not be completely alienated, and yet so plainly that they will not mistake his meaning. So he sets the stage for the, quote, controversy, which aroused heated emotions and which for a time split the congregation into 2 warring camps. And the second lecture was entitled A Little Packet of Earth. And Dr. Burns opens with a verse from the prophet Jeremiah and a related quote from the writer Stanley Romaine Hopper. Men buy and sell their little packets of everlasting earth, largely unconscious of the immortal earth and sky. He refers to several conversations with my father about the housing problems and adds that my parents' dilemma symbolized dramatically the tragedy of the church's involvement in the sin of racism. And after describing the December 13th meeting in great detail, Dr. Burns discusses the stages of group controversy and summarizes 3 concrete and measurable results of the controversy were that there was a sharp decrease in attendance at the worship services, there was some loss in income, and there were a few persons who transferred their membership to other churches. The third lecture was the prophet's problems and rewards. And Dr. Burns reminds the audience that prophetic preaching inevitably will at times arouse opposition and lead the preacher into controversy and conflict. He says, I remember a period a few months after the height of the controversy in our church when I reached a very low point of despair and loneliness and self-pity. A little while before dawn, I went down and sat in the living room and brooded over my loneliness. My wife found me there when she came downstairs to get breakfast. She asked me what was the matter. I started to answer, and suddenly I began to sob. Having seen her husband weep only a few instances previously, she reached out to a neighbor, a wonderful man, he said, a member of our church and of our pastoral relations committee. My wife, without my knowing it, told him about the incident. That night, I was invited to meet with some men who were members of the pastoral relations committee. They wanted to assure me of their complete support and to offer and to share in any way they could. I'll never forget the rich comfort of that evening. The fourth lecture is entitled The Word That Reconciles. And Dr. Burns quotes Bishop James Samuel Thomas. Do you know who Bishop James Samuel Thomas is? The United Methodist bishop who broke racial barriers when appointed in 1964 in Iowa. And that quote is erroneously, most people think that facing issues represents strength, while reconciliation represents weakness. Actually, the matter of Christian reconciliation is rugged business, calling for the finest in courage and the highest integrity in human relations. I want to share one story that Dr. Burns included in his lecture about one individual at St. Paul's, and think about the difference that one individual can make. So he says, while the meeting was in progress, and again, we're talking about 60 years ago tonight, this man got up from his seat and walked over to me and said with great emotion, "You are tearing this church apart." And for many weeks after the meeting, it was obvious that his distress continued. Whenever I would even mention the race problem, I could see him stiffen and feel his displeasure. Then one morning, many months after the meeting, I had decided that the time had come for a full-scale summing up of our situation in the church. The title that morning was St. Paul's Church and the Civil Rights Struggle. After the service, the same man thanked Dr. Burns for the sermon and told him he thought we should have more sermons like that. That week, Dr. Burns also received from that man a 3-page, single-spaced, typewritten letter. And this is what that man described. He said he came to a time when he realized that there were 3 things he might do. He could give up and walk out of the church, he could sit in the pew and grumble, or he could get in and work in the church. And he described how, in his daily conversation, he was seeking to help people gain new perspective on the race problem.
So we dig a bit more deeply into the second lecture, which is of particular importance this evening. Dr. Burns speaks of the time shortly after it was announced that a date for the vote had been determined. And at that time, members of St. Paul's received a note from a group calling themselves the Indian Creek Hills Committee. The letter was signed by 12 men, all living near the lot that was in question. 4 of these men were members of St. Paul's. In their letter addressed to the congregation of St. Paul's Methodist Church, they claimed that there was no question of motives, but they were concerned that church leadership had failed to account for the financial impact of the vote on neighborhood residents. The letter claimed property values would decrease $300,000 to $400,000, with an ominous perhaps more added after that. A simple Google search tells me that the buying power of $300,000 to $400,000 in that time is equivalent to $2.8 to $3.7 million today. The next paragraph begins by noting that most people in the area are not rich. Anybody who can lose $2.7 to $3.8 million is doing fine. They were concerned that this would wipe out their equity. The committee encouraged members to vote with this in mind. We do not believe, this is a quote, "It is a Christian act to help one family and do so much harm to dozens of others in the neighborhood. A trolley wager, if you will." In the days leading up to the vote, the Gazette reported, "No local controversy in recent years has caused more idle gossip or earnest discussion. It was ugly. Dr. Harris's character was attacked. The church's future was framed in the most negative and disastrous light. And others wondered if selling the land to the Harris family would be a large enough gain in the work for social justice to defray the costs of splitting the church. Is it worth it? Is it worth it?" That question seemed to circle in the minds of many leading up to the day 60 years ago.
And we've heard about that evening. We've heard about that evening, and the vote. 751 votes cast after reading through a roll of 3,000 some members. 460 yes, 291 no, to adopt the resolution to accept the offer of purchase submitted by Percy G. Harris and E. Lilia Harris. After the vote, Dr. Burns continues in one of his lectures, "The story of our action had gone out on the Associated Press wires and was printed throughout the United States. Our local paper, however, remained cautiously neutral. In vivid contrast to the flood of response from outside the state and the city was the relative silence I encountered within Cedar Rapids and within the circle of membership at St. Paul's. It was regrettable, of course, that some members left the congregation as a result of this controversy. It should be said, however, that they did not damage the life of the congregation as much as another small group who shared their essential point of view but who did not remove their membership. The members of this second group showed their hostility in various ways.
So we know that some people left, contributions decreased temporarily in the wake of the vote, and others stayed and, as we've just heard, made life difficult here. But Dr. Burns gave the Beecher lectures to encourage other preachers to take up the prophetic task, to take up the prophetic mantle, not to discourage us from doing so. He was encouraging us to embrace the creative role of conflict in the life of the church. When considering that question, was it worth it? Burns gave an emphatic yes, and he named some of the blessings. Many St. Paul's members gained a greater depth in their understanding of why the church existed, a clarity on the nature and mission. It was an opportunity for the church to give witness to the watching world. It was a chance to serve Cedar Rapids and Iowa through the church's actions. Dr. Burns claims by its collective act, the congregation took one small step toward wiping out its shame. That shame, in part, was that Dr. Harris had been a member of this church for 3 years, and no realtor would sell him land. Not all of the benefits either could be quantified. Burns tells there was a new quality that has entered into the corporate life of our congregation, which I find difficult to describe, but which I know is there.
Dr. Burns recognized, and others, that the story did not end with the vote. And now, 60 years later, we know that the story did not end with the vote. And if we go back to that first night of that 4-part series of the Lyman Beecher lectures, Dr. Burns closed his lecture by saying this: "I shall tell this story not as a success story, for it includes elements of failure as well as success. I shall tell it not as an example for others to follow, for the combination of circumstances which made the story possible would not often occur. I shall tell it not as a story with a happy ending, because it has not yet ended, but will be going on in the life of our church and the life of our community for many years to come. My purpose in telling the story will be to provide a concrete instance of what I consider to be a creative controversy in the life of a Christian congregation, so that in discussing controversy, we may relate to a specific example."
Throughout the lectures, Dr. Burns is clear this vote was a matter of existential importance. And if you're here and you're not part of a faith community, feel free to tune out for a minute. But if you are a part of a faith community, this is for us. For Dr. Burns, the question in all of it was whether the church would act in such a way that was worthy of its name and its ideals. I'll conclude these reflections, like Jerry, by hopefully allowing us to go back to the day 60 years ago. It was a cold night, but we need to set the stage as we engage part of the meeting. It's moments after a businessman has just given a speech against selling the land. Many in the crowded sanctuary upstairs were applauding the speech, but Dr. Burns has a sinking feeling in his chest. He's disheartened by what he's seeing his congregation do. He waits for someone to stand up and speak in favor of the sale, but silence instead. That silence compelled Jackson Burns to speak. Among his remarks, he asked some pointed questions. Are we a Christian church or not? And if the majority of this church does not believe that all people are equal in the sight of God, then let's say so to the world. And for Burns, it was bigger than just the 1,000 people who were gathered in a crowded sanctuary. This is not, he quotes, or I quote him, this is not just a little family affair. This is the world. The whole world is here tonight. This is one of the great problems of the world, to say that the church should not be involved in the great problems of the world is to say that the church should not do its job. His closing words were a call to the kind of prayer and action that would exhibit Christian integrity. He ended his speech by saying this, and pray. Do not vote before you pray. Then vote that this church may be Christian in this very important issue. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to have an opportunity to share with you this evening and to look out and see you, and certainly have enjoyed being able to prepare for this evening with Pastor Sherry and Jonathan and Jerry, and also Pastor Scott and Christina from Lovely. This means a whole lot to me, more than I can say. Thank you for all of you who are in attendance. Thank you to members of my family who are watching, and thanks to Mom and Dad. And I just wanted to share a little bit about what it means to me, what my siblings have shared with me that this means to them, and maybe leave us with some closing thoughts. So for nearly my entire pre-adult life, that December 13th meeting generated visions of epic proportion in my mind. And as I recall, the meeting itself was rarely a topic in conversation in our family, at least as I recall. And I say that because I know I have siblings who will say otherwise. But I merely had the sense that Mom and Dad had moved forward. And I understood that when people don't support you, don't let them hold you back. So it may have been 15 years later that Dad provided my 11 siblings and me with a transcript and a cassette recording of the evening. And as I read the transcript, it was easy to sense, to hear, and to feel the tension that permeated the room that night. But I confess, the first time that I listened to the entire recording was last week, as I was preparing for these remarks. The prepared speeches that night and the spontaneous remarks alike were filled with passion. And from time to time, the crowd murmured or erupted in laughter. And with all the discussion related to procedural matters, I feel like the recording could be a case study for Robert's Rules of Order. Now, I'm no stranger to church meetings. I was married for many years to a minister and wore the First Lady hat, figuratively speaking, for 15 years. And currently, I serve as an elder at my church here in Cedar Rapids. So even in a place where love and harmony are expected to prevail, there are times when meetings detour to a slightly less than orderly fashion. So I really do have a keen appreciation for the prayer and preparation that are required to ensure a meeting accomplishes what's necessary in an orderly fashion. Well, while listening to the recording, it occurred to me that much of the discussion could easily have taken place yesterday. Change the names and location and head to the African American Museum of Iowa to hear the recording for yourself. I have fond memories of the Armstrongs and admired the resolve in his voice as he made what I will call the business case for the resolution. I did not know Mrs. Shirley Finger, but have known her name as long as I can remember. And Dr. Burns was a name that I considered an important part of our family history until I had the opportunity to visit him and his wife Evelyn in Maine in the mid-70s. I have been back in Cedar Rapids since 2012. And I now live in the family home with my sister, Sarah. One of the advantages of being there is that we are literally surrounded by bits of history that Mom and Dad have saved. Dad liked to write notes. And one of my favorite items is a ledger that details every expense in building the house. And the item is actually part of the exhibit, the redlining exhibit at the museum. And he wrote in the front cover, "To my wife and children, this booklet is of sentimental value only. Its contents are self-explanatory. Dad, March 28th, 78. And another is dated April 20th, 96. To Harris children, this information lists what former neighbors paid for their homes or lots and what they sold for later. Dad, And after Dad, he wrote, values did not go down. Another advantage of being back in the home where I grew up is reflecting on how my childhood experiences influenced me. For the record, I was born 3 months after the family moved into the house on Beaver Avenue. I have terrific memories of attending St. Paul's Preschool, yes, Erskine, Franklin, and Washington. My siblings and I took full advantage of the woods behind our home and enjoyed the freedom to visit the beautiful gardens in the Armstrong's yard and the giant tree swing. In high school, I presented a violin recital in the sanctuary here in St. Paul's, along with my dear friend and our quartet, and sang at the funeral of a beloved science teacher with the Washington Concert Choir. Today, I have only to look out my kitchen window at the long divided driveways across the street and remember that when my siblings and I took a shortcut to Erskine Elementary School, we could walk on one driveway, which belonged to neighbors that welcomed us, but not the other, which belonged to neighbors that were, well, less than neighborly. Some of you may have heard that story. Well, I finally unlocked a secret more than 50 years later of how those driveways influenced me. I discovered that the shortcut I took from kindergarten through 6th grade undoubtedly contributed to the perfectionist mentality that followed me until recently. I'm a recovered perfectionist. My roommate Sarah will say I'm a recovering perfectionist. In all seriousness, this was arguably the single most important discovery for me upon moving back to the family home, and I had to do something about it. On April 30th of this year, I texted the neighbors across the street. I had become better acquainted with them through the derecho aftermath, one of those silver linings, one of those blessings. Hi, I texted. Would it be okay for me to spend some time walking and praying on your driveway Saturday around 7 a.m.? I've never walked on the neighbor side and have spent lots of time this past year reflecting on the childhood shortcut to Erskine on the other side. Happy to discuss if you have questions. Hope this doesn't sound too odd. Thanks. And one wrote back, sure, you're welcome anytime, and the other, please feel free anytime. So I journaled that morning. It was May 1st, a crisp spring day, and I arose with both anticipation and ambivalence at the prospect of walking the driveways. The sky was clear, and the sun was still making its ascent in the eastern sky. The lilacs had already started blooming, and the leaves were just starting to fill in the spaces of limbs that had taken on new shapes with last summer's storm. The birds provided a delightful background with their chirping. I was grateful for the weather, though I had prepared myself to walk the driveways in my raincoat if the sky brought showers rather than sunshine. I wanted to do this for me, but I also knew I would want to share the experience with others. I was stuck again in that tension between holding too much inside and oversharing. Surely everything is not private, but everyone has such a unique sense of privacy. Now I was on a quest to answer questions that I was pretty sure others would appreciate on their journey. How did it feel? What did I learn? Did I release the baggage? Am I ready to move forward? Well, it turns out those driveways were symbolic for my siblings also. Several of us gathered on a Zoom last summer to trade stories. And running the length of the two driveways is a divider. It's about 75 feet long, so imagine a 75-foot beam right down the center, kind of like a balance beam. So even before I started gymnastics during my youth, I fancied myself a gymnast. And who could resist walking on that beam? Arms out, school bag in tow. For me, walking on the driveway beam was a bit risky, because what if I fell on the unneighborly side? Fortunately, I never did. Some of my siblings, however, were more daring, tapping a toe from time to time on the less than neighborly side. Yet most of the stories we exchanged brought laughs about the neighbors who welcomed us and the dogs that greeted us along the way. Now keep in mind there are 12 of us, and I'm number 8. The first 4 were born in Washington, D.C., where Dad completed his undergraduate degree and medical school. They attended Polk and cherished their experience there. One sibling remembers telling about the upcoming move and describing the house in a writing assignment or show and tell. Living across the street from St. Luke's, they also enjoyed the proximity to Cole College and friendships formed with faculty and their families. The move to Beaver and Erskine meant leaving a home and school where they knew they were welcome. I mentioned earlier that I attended preschool here, as did the younger set of siblings. Sarah shared a very specific memory about going to preschool, and she loved it here. She said, we once made jelly for our moms, our Mother's Day present, and we presented them with a song sung to the tune of Old Smoky. We made you some jelly, and we want you to know that you're the best mommy, and we love you so. That memory started here. And she added preschool is her favorite age of children to work with, perhaps because of the impression that her St. Paul's preschool teacher gave her. And another sibling remembers friendly preschool teachers, the indoor playroom, and our mom making green eggs and ham for the class. So I reached out to my siblings before tonight and also asked them, you know, what's a main impression that they as an adult have now about St. Paul's and that episode in our family history. And I'm just going to read a few quickly. One is, my impressions that most attitudes about race are based on ignorance. And as time passed, some of the neighbors who were opposed to our moving into the neighborhood later became friendly, if not friends. And a few were very apologetic about their opposition. Or another sibling, when I tell people that story now, they're often shocked. And I'm surprised they're shocked, given the fact that racism and prejudice are pervasive even to this day. As an adult, my parents' strength and perseverance has always served as a source of pride, a point of hope, and an echoic warning of the work that tragically remains to be done. The episode in our family history is a reminder to me of the common practice in this country of marginalizing and intentionally mischaracterizing Black and or other ethnic people as a group in order to justify their mistreatment by and for benefit of a dominant group. So I'm very well aware how this episode that I wasn't even alive for really shaped my life, shapes how I interact with others, shapes how I care about this community, our nation, our world, shapes how I care about not only my children, but their children and future generations. And it reminds me of that one individual, that one person who described to Dr. Burns how in his daily conversation, he was seeking to help people gain new perspective on the race problem. You know, again, being in the home, history is surrounding us, and sometimes it's funny because we'll find things from 1990 intermingled with things from 1970, but it can be very delightful. Sometimes it can sort of give you pause to think about, gosh, I never had this conversation with my parents. And one of the things that I found is this big envelope, and Mom had just written on the outside of it, post-house sale letters. And it's a stack of letters that had been written to Dr. Burns and to St. Paul's, in this case, all congratulatory for the vote that took place 60 years ago this evening. There's a letter here, and I won't read them now, but I have one from Viola Gibson, who then passed it on to the national office of the NAACP, to my aunt, one of my aunts, Betty Jean, and my grandmother. And I want to close with something that Sarah shared with me, that when we think about our family, someone remarked to me once that, you know, it's almost as if you escaped redlining. I had to pause. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. And Sarah kind of put into words for me, though, we were and we are beneficiaries of class privilege and advantages that others don't have. And so it's up to us to share this story, but even more so to be involved in efforts that involve fair housing. So thank you for listening to my comments.
Thank you to all of our guests that have been sharing heartfelt, passionate stories. You know, yesterday we had worship service here, and we heard from John the Baptist, a prophet that was passionate about the words that he had to say from God, urging people to change their hearts and their lives. And with that passion, whenever race becomes something that divides us, let's have the passion of John to hear those words for changed hearts and changed lives. We hear the vision of the prophets that have gone before us and the words of valleys being filled and mountains and hills being leveled and the crooked ways made being straight. All of the ways that God can approach us, that we can approach God, that we can approach one another. We hear from the prophets throughout the ages. And we hear from prophets in our contemporary times as well. So we enter this with our hearts as faithful people. Scott, do you want to come up and share briefly the way that our faith informs us in our denomination?
As the United Methodist Church, we're very much focused on a balance of beliefs and behavior, spirituality, social responsibility, personal holiness, social holiness. We also talk about a Wesleyan quadrilateral: scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. We don't make up our mind why we believe what we believe just to do it. We have something behind it all, something that backs it all up. And with all this, I want to lift up our social principles in our United Methodist Church. As a denomination, people of God, we live out our faith. United Methodist social principles come from our understanding of God's call. The rights and privileges a society bestows upon or withholds from those who comprise it indicate the relative esteem in which that society holds particular persons and groups of persons. We affirm all persons as equally valuable in the sight of God. We therefore work towards societies in which each person's value is recognized, maintained, and strengthened. We support the basic rights of all people to equal access to housing, education, communication, employment, medical care, legal redress for grievances, and physical protection. The right of historically underrepresented racial and ethnic persons to equal and equitable opportunities in employment and promotion, to education and training of the highest quality, to non-discrimination in voting, access to public accommodations and housing purchase or rental, to credit, financial loans, venture capital, and insurance policies, to positions of leadership and power in all elements of our life together, and to full participation in the church and society. Again, our United Methodist social principles very much bringing out our focus on a belief that we balance our behavior with our deep thoughts, and again, scripture, tradition, experience, and reason.
So we still have needs in housing. We'll show us a slide here that has been shared some statistics that name some housing struggles currently in Cedar Rapids. And I want to say thank you to Clint Tweepall for sharing some of these statistics from the Lynn County Continuum of Care. It's a group of nonprofits that work together on homelessness issues and long-term housing needs. You'll see 75% of whites in Cedar Rapids own their home. 30% of non-whites in Cedar Rapids own their home. The number of people living outdoors in Cedar Rapids, 100, 200 currently in local homeless shelters, an increase of 160% in homelessness since 2019. 40% of Lynn County families struggling to pay rent. 21% spend more than 1/3 of their monthly income on rent. We still have work to do and places for prayer and action. Jerry, would you like to come and share?
Tonight we've heard a lot of stories. We've heard stories, memories, impressions. We've heard about hurts and fears and struggles and celebrations, joys, new beginnings. All of that has moved us on a journey. We have identified one spot on that journey, December 13, 1961, at St. Paul's Methodist Church, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Tonight, we are at another point on that journey. Again, we're at St. Paul's on a December 13th, but the year is 2021. Although there has been movement on that journey, we have not reached the destination. Even after 60 years, we do not have a home for all. Bishop Lori Haller, our Iowa Conference Bishop of the United Methodist Church, says, "Please thank the congregation for the collective courage of those who went before them to act justly. I will be with you in prayer this evening." So after 60 years, when we still do not have a home for all, we gather to make our confession. We recognize God's grace, and we commit to continuing the journey, working toward the day in which there is indeed a home for all. I'd ask you to read the bold print after I read the light print. Our church declares, racism is the combination of the power to dominate by one race over other races and a value system that assumes that the dominant race is innately superior to the others. Racism is sin. We repent of our actions which control others, while seeking to remember always that all persons are beloved children of God. Our church defines racial discrimination as the disparate treatment and lack of full access and equity in resources, opportunities, and participation in the church and in society based on race or ethnicity. Racial discrimination is sin. We repent that we so easily laud our own stories of the past and the gifts of the majority culture, while we strive to recognize the blessings and contributions of persons of all races, places, and times. Use of economic and judicial systems to oppress and restrict is sin. We repent of our own participation in unjust systems, while working to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Closing doors, creating barriers, shutting out the other, denying another a place to lay their head, these are sin. Closing our minds, turning our backs, stopping our ears, shutting our eyes, these are sin. God in the Spirit, revealed in Jesus Christ, calls us by grace to be renewed in the image of our Creator, that we may be one in divine love for the world. Today is the day God embraces all hues of humanity, delights in diversity and difference, favors solidarity, transforming strangers into friends, and so shall we. And so shall we.
Continuing this evening in confession and commitment, we have 4 prayer stations around this room. And as United Methodists, yes, that means we are going to get out of our seats and we're going to move around. So in the station right in front of me is our station of remembrance. And lighting a candle in the Christian tradition is something deeply held within our tradition. So in this station, we invite you to light a candle in honor of someone or something in remembrance. And in the back over here is our station of confession. And in this station, we invite you to take a moment to reflect on how you contribute to inequality in our society, how you contribute to racism. And in that station, we invite you to write a prayer of confession. And the paper in the back are all plantable paper. They have seeds of flower seeds and herbs. And you can take that with you and plant it, or you might leave it there and we'll collect them after and plant them somewhere in the community. In the back over here is our station of commitment. In the back over there, there are rocks and permanent markers. And in this station, we invite you to write a word of action that you commit to. And as these rocks are small, you can hold on to them every day in your pocket to be reminded of the commitment to action that you have made. And over here is orange paper. And we invite you to lift up a prayer, answering some of these questions. What are we going to do now that we're neighbors? How do we share life together? And what are we committing to? We'll have about 10 minutes to explore these prayer stations. Let us be in reflection.
May the peace of Christ be with you. Let us share signs with Christ's peace with one another and all the world.
Mark, we really appreciate your remarks. Great. Very good. Yes.
That was great. Nice to see you. Fine, yeah. If you are in a lot okay and you're healthy and
They're staying.
so.
Don't, because I can't read all the words. Don't, no. But I can't keep all the words and music together. Oh, yeah. No, don't do this.
All right, we're going to start from the beginning. First verse. Ready? Yeah, I think we got the tune now. Let's sing it. My soul cries out with a joyful shout that the God of my heart is great. And my spirit sings of the wondrous things that you bring to the ones who wait. You fixed your sight on the servant's plight, and my weakness you did not spurn. So from east to west shall my name be blessed, could the world be about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. Though I am small, my God, my all, you work great things in me. And your mercy will last from the depths of the past to the end of the age to be. Your very name puts the proud to shame, and to those who would for you yearn. You will show your might, put the strong to fight, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. From the halls of power to the fortress tower, not a stone will be left on stone. King, beware, for your justice fears every tyrant from Rome his throne. The hungry poor shall we eat no more, for the food they can never earn. There are tables spread, every mouth be fed, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn. Though the nations rage from age to age, we remember who holds us fast. God's mercy must deliver us from the conqueror's rushing grasp. This saving world that our forebears heard is the promise which holds us bound, till the spear and rod can be crushed by God, who is turning the world around. My heart shall sing of the day you bring, let the fires of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near, and the world is about to turn.
You sounded really good. You sounded really good. Thank you for coming. I offer this blessing, a blessing that was passed from Moses to Aaron, and we pass to you for this generation and for each one, that the Lord may bless you and keep you. May the Lord have his face shine upon you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. Go in peace, my friend, and see the light before us and be the light. Amen.